One day, maybe soon. Maybe in another 100 years the wind will stop once more. The stars will hesitate. The plains will hold their breath. And in that stillness, the earth will listen again to its oldest song. When it does, perhaps the council will return, not in flesh but in memory and the quiet harmony between light and shadow, sound and silence, the living and the gone. Because the photograph was never about capturing death. It was about proving that silence can live forever. That memory once awakened never truly sleeps. So if you ever find yourself in Pine Ridge under that endless Dakota sky, stop for a moment. Listen. Don't look for ghosts. Don't look for proof. Just feel the air. When the wind fades and the world grows too quiet, that's them. The council, the land, the moment when time itself forgot to move. And if you wait long enough, you might hear it, the soft click of a shutter buried under a century of snow, the breath of the hills exhaling, the whisper of the sky remembering its own stillness. And then you'll understand why the Oglala still gather every winter to tell the story. By the fire, their voices low, their eyes turned toward the horizon that never changes. Why they say the photograph was not the end of the beginning, but the beginning. Why they believe that one night the sky will stand still again, not in grief but in grace. The night the sky stood still, but was never over. It is still happening in every silence, in every shadow, in every heartbeat that forgets itself between breaths. And somewhere under the frozen stars of Dakota, the photograph still waits, the light still humming, the wind still learning how to move again. Until that day comes, listen carefully. When the world goes quiet, you'll know you found it. That place where history breathes, where silence is alive, where time looks back. The night the sky stood still. People say the photograph captured a single second, but maybe that second never ended. Maybe we are still living inside it, caught between the last breath of the Oglala and the first silence of the modern world. If time truly paused that night, then maybe it's still waiting for someone to notice. Do you think that moment ever ended, or is it still happening somewhere between history and memory? Tell me in the comments. Welcome to one of the strangest nights in American history. In the 1880s at Pine Ridge, 8 Oglala leaders sat for a photograph. When the shutter was pressed, the wind stopped. The lamps went out and the sky seemed locked in place. No one could explain what happened. From that night on, the air around Pine Ridge was never the same. Some believe it was a sign from the spirits. Others say it was the land itself warning mankind. What do you think really happened that night? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The wind moved slow that morning across the Black Hills, a low breath crawling over frozen grass, whispering through the bones of the plains. The land was still, as though holding something inside an old memory, an echo of drums that no longer beat. From the horizon to the horizon, snow glimmered like dusted glass, unbroken, except for the shadows of old bison trails long since abandoned. They called it God's country now, but the Oglala called it the heart of the world. The sacred spine of the earth, Pahasapa, the Black Hills. To the Sioux, these hills were not just land. They were alive, breathing, dreaming. The rocks were the bones of ancestors, the rivers their veins. Even now, in the dying light of the century, that belief had not died. But the world around them was changing faster than faith could hold. The army forts stood like iron teeth across the plains, each one a wound that never healed. Trains cut through buffalo country, steam engines screaming where once only eagles cried. The herds that had darkened the earth for centuries were gone. Millions turned to bones whitening under the sun. The air that once smelled of sage and smoke now carried only ash and gunpowder. The wars were said to be over, but every breath still tasted like smoke. In the year the photograph was taken, the Sioux had already been broken, at least on paper. Red Cloud had signed, Sitting Bull had fled north, Crazy Horse had fallen, stabbed beneath a flag of truce. But to the Oglala who gathered at Pine Ridge, the war was not finished. They knew treaties were only pauses, words written to give the white man time to reload. The Dawes Act had already begun to slice the land into pieces, offering the illusion of ownership while draining it of spirit. Agents spoke of civilization, agriculture, progress. They spoke in calm tones the way one speaks to children or prisoners. But beneath that language lay another truth, the slow erasure of a world that had once stretched from the Missouri to the Rockies. The air that morning was brittle with cold. Frost clung to every blade of grass, turning the hills white as bone. Overhead the sky hung gray and heavy, a lid of clouds pressing down on the world. Somewhere in the distance, a single gunshot echoed, maybe a soldier practicing, maybe a hunter desperate for the last of the winter game. The echo rolled for miles, bouncing between canyons until it became something else, a hollow sound, almost like a drum. Inside the agency at Pine Ridge, a meeting had been called. Officially, it was to discuss new land allotments, new rations, new rules. Unofficially, it was a gathering of ghosts. Men who had once led armies of riders now sat beneath the government's roof, wrapped in worn blankets instead of war paint. Yet in their eyes, the fire remained. They spoke little, they did not need to. They knew why they were there to decide whether to bend further or break completely. Outside, the white flags of snow twisted in the wind, catching the light. A few soldiers lingered near the agency door, rifles slung low, pretending not to watch. They joked quietly, boots scraping on the frost. The interpreter, a thin man named John Kolhoff, stood between worlds Lakota by blood English by tongue. He would later say that when he entered that room, something in the air changed. It felt, he wrote, as if the earth itself was listening. Even the stove went quiet. The photographer had been sent by Washington to document the peaceful progress of the Sioux. He was told to capture evidence proof that the old warriors had laid down their defiance. He had no idea that the act of pressing his shutter would become a story told for generations. He was simply doing his job. But that morning, as he unpacked his camera, something in the silence unsettled him. The building creaked. The floorboards groaned as though shifting under weight unseen. And when he looked through his lens, he thought for the briefest moment that the air behind the men was moving as if shadows had weight. He told no one. Not then. But years later, when he was old and half-blind, he would write in his diary, "There was a stillness in that room that did not belong to this earth. I felt watched, not by men, but by something older, larger, waiting to be remembered." To understand Pine Ridge, one must understand the silence of the plains. It is not the silence of peace, but of aftermath. The land itself seemed to remember every hoof, every scream, every flame. To the east lay Wounded Knee Creek, quiet now but heavy with omens. To the north, the Black Hills loomed, stolen under the Treaty of 1868, seized when gold was found, desecrated by miners who cared nothing for the sacred. The Oglala said that ever since then the wind had changed. It no longer sang, it whispered. It carried the voices of the dead, restless, calling their names into the grass. Fact and folklore became one on those plains. The soldiers called it superstition. The Lakota called it memory. Some nights, riders said they saw lights moving along the ridges, pale orbs drifting above the old trails. Some said they were the souls of fallen warriors searching for their horses. Others said they were the stars themselves, come down to listen to what men had done in their name. The priests who arrived later with Bibles dismissed it as trick of weather. But even they locked their doors at night when the wind began to hum. In the Black Hills, weather was a living thing. Summer came fast, wild with lightning. Autumn bled into winter without warning. And winter was a gut. It could strip the flesh from a man's bones and leave him standing like a statue of ice. That winter of the council, the cold was merciless. Cattle froze where they stood. The Missouri ran thick and silent, its surface glassy as stone. The children at the agency school wrote with fingers cracked from frost, reciting words in a language that was not their own. And all the while, rumors drifted like smoke, rumors of new taxes, new divisions, new soldiers coming from Fort Robinson. But beneath those rumors was another whisper, one no white man wanted to hear. The ghost dance. Across the reservations, word spread of a vision of a prophet who claimed the old world would return. The buffalo would rise and the white man's houses would crumble like dust. The government called it sedition. The Sioux called it hope. Even at Pine Ridge, men spoke of it softly after dark around the fires. They danced when the moon was thin, their shadows flickering against the teepees. The agents warned them to stop. They did not. They said the dance was not rebellion, it was remembrance. And so when the Oglala leaders gathered for their council in that little studio, they carried not just fear, but prophecy. The treaties they signed were dead letters. The land beneath them was alive. The white men who stood behind them did not understand that. They looked at the chiefs as relic specimens to be recorded before extinction. They did not see that extinction was already a wound in the air. They did not hear what the Oglala heard, the faint hum beneath the wind, the heartbeat of the plains refusing to die. As the photographer adjusted his lens, he could not have known that he was recording more than history. The Oglala sat unmoving, but their silence was not submission, it was resistance. It was the stillness of the storm's eye. Behind those calm faces was everything that had been lost, the sound of the buffalo herds rolling like thunder across the earth, the laughter of children by the fire, the songs of the sun, dance, the prayers whispered to stones and stars. All of it pressed into that moment, into that frame of glass. Later, people would call it superstition. They would say it was coincidence that the light bent that way, that the exposure burned too long, that one of the figures seemed to fade and return when the print was made. They would explain it with science, but those who had lived through that winter, those who had seen the land go silent, knew better. They knew that sometimes when the world breaks, time itself stops to bear witness. The hills would soon bleed again. Wounded Knee was not far off, only months away. But that night in the studio before the soldiers came and before the rifles cracked, the world gave them one gift, a stillness so complete it felt eternal. The Oglala would say later that the earth had stopped turning to let them be remembered. The photographer would never take another image of them again. The glass plate, when developed, shimmered faintly in the light, as if the men inside were breathing still. And when the curator in Washington examined it decades later, he wrote a single line in his report. Subjects appear alive. The hills outside Pine Ridge still keep that silence. The snow still glows pale under the moon. And sometimes when the wind moves just right, it carries the echo of that shudder, the moment history tried to turn away but the sky refused to move. That was the winter the world stood still. The winter when memory became light. The winter when the Oglala sat before the lens of time and the heavens themselves held their breath. The snow had not yet melted that spring, and the hills still carried the echo of winter, its silence, its weight, its warning. The sky over Pine Ridge was the color of smoke, thin, washed in pale gold, the kind of light that makes everything look older than it is. The plains stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of dead grass swaying under the cold breath of the wind. Out there, where the horizon folds into the curve of the earth, time seemed slower. It didn't pass, it hovered. By 1880-something, the historians can never quite agree on which year the Oglala Sioux had been reduced from a nation of riders to a people, confined by lines on a map. Pine Ridge Agency stood as a symbol of that change, half prison, half sanctuary. Wooden fences, army barracks, a schoolhouse where children were taught to forget their language. The American flag fluttered above the agency, bright and heavy like an accusation. Yet in the center of that stillness, there remained a heartbeat, the council fire. Every few months, the Oglala elders would gather in defiance of Washington's timetables. They would speak not to negotiate, but to remember, to speak the names of those whose bones were now scattered along the Platte, the Yellowstone, the Bighorn. Names erased from reports, but never from memory. One such gathering was called in the late winter of the 1880s. It was not announced in newspapers. It was not authorized. It was as one white agent later wrote, a meeting of silent men speaking to things unseen. They met inside the small wooden hall near the agency, the same place where weeks later the famous photograph would be taken. Outside, soldiers stood watch, stamping their boots against the cold. Inside, the air was heavy with pipe smoke and low voices. The Oglala spoke in Lakota, their words slow measured, carrying the rhythm of wind and fire. The interpreter sat near the door, hands shaking as he tried to follow. Every few sentences he would pause, not because he didn't understand, but because there were no English words for what they were saying. The chiefs spoke of the Pahasapa, the Black Hills, the heart of everything. They spoke of how the gold rush had carved open their mother's skin. They spoke of treaties that promised peace but delivered hunger. They spoke of children forced into schools where their hair was cut and their spirits scolded. And they spoke of dreams, the kind that came not in sleep but in the long moments between breaths when the world went quiet and the ancestors whispered through the wind. Tallbear, the man at the center of the photograph, spoke little that night. He was not known for speeches. His power was in his silence. But when he finally did speak, the others listened. His voice was deep, slow, like stones rolling down a riverbed. He said the earth had changed its rhythm, that even the birds flew differently, that the stars no longer guided the hunters the way they once had. He said there was a sickness, not of the body but of the sky itself. When men forget who they are, he said the land forgets too. The interpreter didn't translate that part. He didn't need to. The white agent sitting nearby only shifted uncomfortably in his chair, jotting notes about restlessness among the natives. Outside, a storm was building, not of rain but of dust. The wind picked up, sliding across the plains like a whisper turned sharp. The soldiers looked up uneasy. One swore he heard chanting. Another thought he saw movement in the tall grass, though nothing was there. Inside, the conversation turned to omens. One elder face, carved deep with age, spoke of a vision he had seen weeks earlier, the moon turning black, the stars, freezing mid-sky, and a sound like a drum beating under the earth. He said it was not a dream, it was a memory of what was coming. The others nodded. They had seen things too. Shadows moving where no light fell. Horses refusing to cross certain parts of the valley, the air humming before sunrise. To the government men it was madness. To the Oglala it was truth. Fact and faith were not opposites, they were the same river flowing in two directions. That same night, miles away in Washington, the Bureau of Indian Affairs drafted a new proposal, cutting rations, demanding further surrender of land for development. They believed the tribes would accept, they always did. but they had underestimated the weight of silence. At Pine Ridge, silence had become its own language. Every look, every breath carried meaning. When the elders fell quiet, it was not because they had nothing to say, it was because the air was already full of voices. The photographer who would later take the famous picture had not yet arrived, but the air already carried a shadow. His name was William Anders, though his signature would fade from every archive except one. He was a man of science, not faith, but he was also a man who believed that light never lies. And yet, when he came to Pine Ridge, even his lens would be fooled. Weeks later, when he stood behind that camera, he could not have known what had been said in that room before him, how the men had already made peace with the fact that they were the last of their kind. He could not have felt the pulse of prophecy running through the floorboards. But something in the air must have reached him, because when the shutter clicked, the wind outside stopped moving and never quite started again. That is why perhaps the photograph feels alive, because it is not just a picture of men, it is the echo of that meeting captured in silver. A treaty not written on paper, but in stillness. Among the Sioux, it is said that when great change comes, the earth gives a warning. Sometimes it is thunder before a battle. Sometimes it is light before death. At Pine Ridge, it was silence. Even the animals knew. The horses grew restless that week, refusing to drink from the stream near the agency. The dogs howled without reason. Women spoke of strange dreams of rivers flowing backward, of smoke rising from the ground, of stars falling into the grass and burning without flame. The priests called it pagan fear. The agents called it fatigue. But to the Oglala, it was the land trying to speak. In the archives, there are letters written by the Indian agent at Pine Ridge dated the same season. They hold their councils still, he wrote. They speak of spirits, they light fires at night. I believe they plan something, perhaps another uprising. But what the government could not understand was that the uprising had already happened. It was not fought with rifles or blades. It was fought with memory, with the refusal to forget. Every time the Oglala gathered, every time they spoke their language, every time they sang an old song, they declared war on oblivion. And so the council continued deep into the night while the storm rolled unseen beyond the hills. Men spoke, women waited, children listened outside the walls. The wind rose higher, carrying the scent of sage and smoke, until even the white officers fell silent. Something moved through the air, something neither side could name. Later, those who were there would say the sky flickered once, just once, as if lightning had flashed without clouds. And then came the stillness, the same stillness that would return days later when the camera caught it. Fact would record it as coincidence. Folklore would remember it as a visitation. But between those two, in the thin place where truth and myth blur, the story of Pine Ridge found its shape. Because for the Oglala, the Black Hills were not just home, they were the center of all things. And when that center was wounded, the world itself shuddered. The night the council met was not just a political gathering. It was a ceremony of remembrance, a ritual disguised as negotiation, an unspoken prayer for the land to listen one last time. And maybe it did. For that night, as the elders left the hall, the snow had begun to fall again, soft, steady, endless. The stars above them did not move. The horizon glowed faintly, as if the earth itself were lit from within. The wind died. The fire burned without sound. And for a heartbeat long enough to remember, the world went silent again. The snow began to thaw slowly across Pine Ridge, but the silence stayed. It was a strange kind of silence, the kind that hums, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. After the council, after the photograph, people went about their days as if nothing had happened. Yet something in the air had shifted. The wind blew softer, almost careful, like it was afraid to disturb what had been left behind. Days turned into weeks, and then into a season that felt too long. The soldiers at the agency grew restless. The ration wagons came late. The cattle starved in the fields. The sky never seemed to clear completely. Always gray, always heavy, like a storm waiting behind glass. And all the while, the Oglala spoke less and listened more, because the land itself was whispering. William Anders, the photographer, stayed longer than planned. The agency superintendent had asked him to continue documenting life on the reservation, progress he called it. Photographs of the new school, the ration line, the blacksmith shop, the domesticated Indians planting corn. Anders obeyed, but every time he raised his camera, he felt a chill, as though someone or something was standing just behind him. His assistant Henry noticed it first. "Sir," he said one morning, his voice trembling slightly, "these photographs, they don't dry right." Anders frowned, irritated. "It's the humidity. Keep them near the stove." But Henry shook his head. "No, sir, it's not that. The images, they breathe." Anders didn't understand at first. Then one evening, while cleaning his glass plates, he saw it. a faint pulse barely perceptible rippling through the image of the Oglala Council. It wasn't the flicker of the lantern, it wasn't a trick of the eye. The photograph seemed alive, as if the air trapped inside it was trying to escape. He leaned closer, squinting under the weak light, and noticed something else. The central figure, Tall Bear, had changed again. Changed. When the photo was first developed, his eyes had been half shut, gazing somewhere beyond the lens. Now they were open wider, focused, almost aware. Anders stepped back, the lantern light trembling in his hand. "Impossible," he whispered. But when he blinked, the eyes seemed to fade back to their original stillness. He didn't sleep that night. By dawn, the wind had risen again, sweeping through the agency with an icy hiss. Soldiers woke to find their tents half collapsed, their rifles covered in frost. And yet, though the air was biting cold, no one could find snow anywhere. Just frost clinging to everything like breath turned to glass. That morning, the interpreter Kohlhoff came to Anders's cabin. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice hoarse. He said he hadn't slept either. "They danced last night," he whispered. "Who did? The dead." Anders stared at him, unsure if it was madness or metaphor. Kohlhoff continued. "On the ridge, just beyond the trees, I heard the drums. The soldiers did too, but they think it was thunder." He leaned closer. "You saw them that night, didn't you, when you took the photograph?" Anders didn't answer. He didn't need to. The following week brought more oddities. The agency's livestock grew, uneasy horses bolting for no reason, dogs howling at invisible shapes in the fields. At night, faint lights flickered over the plains. White, slow-moving orbs drifting just above the ground, vanishing when approached. Soldiers claimed it was swamp gas. The Oglala said it was the spirits of their ancestors walking the trails once more. Then came the whispers. The women spoke first. They said their children woke screaming, claiming to see men standing outside their tents, men wearing old clothes with feathers in their hair, their faces pale as dust. The elders said not to fear. The ones who stood before the camera, they said, have crossed back to remind us what was lost. The government agent, a man named Wilcox, grew impatient with the stories. He called it Indian hysteria, a side effect of idleness and superstition. In his report to Washington, he wrote, "The natives have begun their ghost tales again. It is important we reassert order before delusions of prophecy take root." But deep down, even he was uneasy. He'd begun to dream strange dreams himself. Dreams of a sky that stood still, of the sound of drumming from beneath the ground. Anders tried to keep working. He forced himself to photograph the agency school one afternoon, a group of children in uniform standing stiffly under the teacher's watchful gaze. But when he developed the plate, something was wrong again. The image was blurred, not from motion, but from something else. A faint haze hung around the children's faces like smoke. And behind them on the wall where the flag was hung appeared a faint outline of another figure, tall, indistinct, impossible to explain. He threw the plate against the wall and shattered it. Henry, terrified, begged him to leave Pine Ridge, but Anders couldn't. Something bound him to that photograph, the first one, the one from the council. At night, he would sit in the dark lantern low, staring at it. The faces looked back, silent, solemn. Yet every time he blinked, he thought he saw movement, subtle shifts in posture, shadows deepening around the eyes. The photograph was no longer a picture to him. It was a doorway, a wound in time. That spring, the storms came. The first one rolled across the plains without thunder, without rain, just wind. Endless, unbroken wind. It tore shingles from roofs, stripped bark from trees, scattered the dry earth like smoke. For 3 days, the agency sat in near darkness. The air was so thick with dust that men couldn't see the hills a mile away. The soldiers tied ropes between the barracks and the mess hall so they wouldn't lose their way. And through it all, faint sounds like distant singing carried on the gale. When the storm passed, the land looked different. The grass had been flattened in long sweeping circles, like something vast had lain down upon it. The Oglala elders called it Waniyetu Luta, the red winter, the year when the spirits walked the plains again. Anders wanted to leave then. He packed his camera, his plates, his journal. But that night, as he prepared to depart, someone knocked on his door. When he opened it, no one was there, only the wind, and in it, faint footsteps receding into the dark. He stepped outside, heart pounding, and saw a figure standing at the far edge of the field, a tall man cloaked in shadow, motionless against the horizon. He called out, but the wind swallowed his voice. The figure did not move. Then just as suddenly it was gone. The next morning, he found something near the edge of the field, a feather perfectly white lying in the frost. He picked it up and turned it over. It wasn't from any bird he recognized. The barbs shimmered faintly as if reflecting light that wasn't there. He put it in his case beside the photograph. The longer he stayed, the worse it became. He began hearing whispers in the darkroom, soft, rhythmic, like breathing through the walls. Sometimes words, sometimes only the faint hiss of syllables he couldn't understand. The more he listened, the clearer they became. Lakota words. A prayer. He didn't know their meaning, but he could feel it in his bones. Henry left first. One morning he was simply gone. No note, no goodbye. Only his coat remained hanging by the door. Anders didn't go looking. The same day, a soldier vanished from his post on the North Watchtower. The next morning, they found him half a mile from camp, standing upright in the snow, eyes open, unblinking hands at his sides, dead but still standing. The army sealed the report. Exposure, they wrote. Froze where he stood. But the Oglala said otherwise. The spirits called him to witness, they whispered. He looked too long into the place between. The tension at Pine Ridge grew unbearable. The ghost dance spread faster now, carried by rumor and desperation. The agents banned it. The people danced anyway. And each time they did, the air trembled the same humming, the same invisible pulse Anders had felt in his darkroom. The wind would stop during those nights, completely. And then after the drums fell silent, a light would move along the horizon, slow flickering circling the camp like a watchful eye. Anders wrote about it in his journal. There is something here that does not belong to time. I have seen the wind stop. I have seen the stars refuse to move. I have seen the earth hold its breath. The camera does not lie, but it does not tell the whole truth either. He began to believe the Oglala were right, that his photograph had trapped something it should not have touched. He dreamed of the council every night. The men seated in a half circle, unmoving. But in the dream they turned their heads, one by one. And when they looked at him, their eyes were not accusing, they were waiting. He left Pine Ridge before the killings began, before the gunfire at Wounded Knee, before the snow turned red. But even far from the plains, he could not escape it. The photograph haunted him. He hid it away, sold his equipment, moved to the city. Yet in the quiet hours before dawn, he swore he could still hear the wind from that place, the hum of frozen air, the sound of stars that refused to turn. And back at Pine Ridge, the stories never stopped. The old women said that when the storms rolled down from the Black Hills, you could still see the faint shapes of riders in the lightning. That if you listened closely, the earth itself whispered the words of the council, the last prayers of the Oglala, before the world broke. They said the photograph had stolen that moment, sealed it in glass, and because of that, time in Pine Ridge never truly moved forward. The soldiers left the agencies, changed, the roads came, but the air was still the same. The wind still paused once every winter. The sky still carried that faint, invisible tension, as if the world had never started turning again after that night. And the photograph? It still exists. Hidden deep within an archive drawer, mislabeled and forgotten. Those who've seen it in person say it's nothing special, just another black and white image of men in old clothes staring into a camera. But those who've stood alone in the room with it say something different. They say the air feels wrong. They say the shadows around the edges seem to shift when the light changes. They say that if you stay long enough, you can hear it. A low hum, a heartbeat, the faint sound of breath trapped inside the silence. That's how the legend of the Oglala Council became something more than history. It became a memory that refused to die, a scar on the fabric of time. And long after the wars ended, long after the treaties turned to dust, the land still remembers. That photograph, the moment when men sat between life and legend and the sky itself, stood still. The snow had long melted from the ridges by the time the stories began to fade. But the silence never truly left Pine Ridge. It lingered like a ghost, one that refused to be buried by time or reason. Officially, the Oglala Council photograph was filed away as a cultural record, a relic of a vanishing people, a curiosity from the frontier. But to those who had been there, to those who had looked into the still eyes of that frozen image, it was something else entirely. In the archives of Washington, the glass plate was logged under entry number 473 BC Oglala Delegation, Pine Ridge Agency C-1880s. A notation in the margin read, "Exceptional clarity, possible double exposure anomaly." No one could explain what kind of anomaly it was. The technicians tested the glass under every light. They measured it for cracks, for fogging, for flaws. None. The surface was perfect, and yet each time the plate was photographed, something new appeared. A faint shimmer like heat over sand. A ripple, as though the image was never fully still. By 1905, a rumor spread quietly among the archivists. They said the Oglala photograph was alive. No one said it aloud during working hours. It was spoken only in bars and hallways, whispered between colleagues when the lights flickered or when a draft swept through the reading rooms. One clerk, a man named Harlan, swore that when he moved the plate to another cabinet, he felt resistance, as if the glass had weight beyond its mass. Another claimed that the temperature of the storage room dropped each time the file drawer was opened. "It breathes cold," he said. For decades, the government ignored these rumors, but the records show something strange. Between 1910 and 1933, the photograph was moved 6 times between departments, each time labeled differently. Ethnographic sample, historical evidence, restricted image, and then mysteriously not for display. The official explanation was preservation, but among the archivists, it was fear. Meanwhile, back at Pine Ridge, the Oglala kept their own version of the story alive. They said that after the photograph was taken, one of the men in that council, Tall Bear, began to dream of a place he had never seen, a room full of strangers staring at his image. He saw his own face on glass framed by smoke and light. He saw men in strange clothing pointing at him, whispering in languages he did not know. And in every dream, there was one detail that never changed: the sound of wind frozen in the air like the breath of something vast and waiting. He told his son that the photograph had taken more than their likeness. It took the silence between our words, he said. It took what we left unsaid. Years later, when his descendants were forced into boarding schools and his name was nearly erased from the agency rolls, that story survived. One of his grandsons, a scout for the U.S. Cavalry, told an officer in 1898 that his grandfather's spirit still walked the hills during storms. He never left that day, the scout said. He is still listening for the wind to move again. The officer laughed at the time. But a week later, that same man was thrown from his horse during patrol under a sky that was, by all accounts, perfectly still. His neck snapped before he hit the ground. The Lakota said it was the photograph claiming another witness. In 1936, the image resurfaced in an exhibition cataloged as Faces of the Vanishing West. The exhibit lasted 1 week. On the second day, the curator, a woman named Helen Ross, collapsed during a private tour. Witnesses claimed she had been describing the photograph when she suddenly gasped and said, "It moved." She died of a heart attack hours later. Her assistant, who found her notes, burned them on the spot. Only one line survived. "The eyes that are not looking at me, they are looking behind me." The exhibition closed within days. The photograph vanished again. By then, folklore had overtaken fact. The Oglala said the government had sealed the glass in lead, fearing the curse of the still sky. Others said the image was hidden beneath the Smithsonian, where it could no longer see the light. But one rumor, half whispered by an aging archivist in 1952, said something else entirely: that during an electrical test of the plate, an image appeared briefly on the wall behind it. A second exposure, a reflection. The silhouette of a man not in the original frame, tall, indistinct, standing over the council as if emerging from smoke. When they looked again, the shadow was gone. The technician resigned that night. In Pine Ridge, meanwhile, the memory never dimmed. The elders spoke of a sleeping circle where the spirits of the council still gathered. They said if you stood in that room at midnight when the wind was right, you could hear a faint click, the sound of the old camera shutter, followed by silence so deep it felt like falling. Hunters avoided the area. The new agency workers laughed, but none stayed in that building after dusk. One man, a missionary named Peter Harlan, the same surname as the Washington clerk, though no relation, spent the winter of 1948 in Pine Ridge trying to disprove the stories. He wrote long letters to his church superiors dismissing the council legend as pagan residue. But in his final report, he described a night he could not explain. "The wind stopped," he wrote, "utterly. The fire did not move. Even the candles stood still. The air thickened, and for a moment I thought the room would collapse inward. Then I saw them, not as shapes, but as weight pressing against the dark. I do not believe in their gods, but they believe in me." He died the following year in an accident no one witnessed. His journal was found open on his desk. The last line read, "The photograph is awake. Fact tries to explain what legend cannot, and yet the deeper one looks, the more the two begin to blend." By the late 20th century, when historians attempted to trace the original Oglala photograph, they found something curious. The catalog entry still existed, but the physical file did not. The drawer marked 473 BC was empty. Its card simply read, "Transferred to Department Unknown." But in a climate-controlled vault in Maryland, among military negatives and anthropological slides, one technician found a sealed crate labeled, "Bureau of Indian Affairs, do not reopen." Inside were dozens of glass plates. Most were portraits of treaties, delegations, and settlements. But at the very bottom, wrapped in black cloth, was the image of the Oglala Council. The technician, a woman named Laura Keene, examined it under sterile light. The glass was intact, the emulsion perfectly preserved. But what she saw inside made her step back. The shadows behind the men had deepened noticeably, and the faint haze that once surrounded their heads was no longer faint. It had shape. She replaced the plate, sealed the box, and filed an internal report. The next morning, the crate was gone. No record of its removal, No signature. Only one note left behind in her handwriting. If you listen long enough, the stillness hums. She resigned a month later. Her colleagues said she moved west. Others said she never left the vault. To the Oglala, these stories were not strange, they were expected. They said that when the camera opened its eye that night, it caught more than the light of the room. It caught the breath of the land the moment the Black Hills themselves tried to remember what they had lost. The spirits were not trapped, one elder said. They were waiting. In the language of the Lakota, there is a word wonia, which means both breath and spirit. They say the two cannot be separated. The wind is the voice of the world. When it stops, the world is listening. That night in the 1880s, the wind stopped and has never truly started again. When the ghost dance spread through the reservations years later, it was said that its rhythm matched the beat of that stillness, the heartbeat of a sky that had once frozen above the Oglala Council. The dancers said they could feel it when they closed their eyes, the hum, the silence, the breath caught between worlds. And so the photograph became more than a story. It became a warning, a prophecy made visible. The elder said, "One day the sky will stop again, and when it does, they will return." In 1973, during the standoff at Wounded Knee, an old man named Henry Two Elk was interviewed by a journalist from Rapid City. He was 93 years old, nearly blind, his voice trembling like wind through dry grass. When asked what he remembered of the old stories, he smiled faintly and said, "When I was a boy, I saw the photograph. They said it was cursed. But I didn't see a curse. I saw a door. Those men. They're still in there waiting for us to listen." The journalist published the quote in a small column no one noticed. But later that year, a copy of the photograph appeared in an anonymous envelope on her desk. No return address, so? Check address? No note, only the image. She looked at it once, then locked it away. When her assistant later opened the drawer, the photo was gone. In its place was a single feather white untouched lying across the empty file. Fact and folklore now live together inseparable. Historians still argue about the photograph, its origin, its supposed anomalies, the missing plate. Some say it was destroyed. Others claim it remains hidden deep in a government vault wrapped in cloth, its surface still shining with that impossible light. But the people who live near Pine Ridge don't argue. They know better. Because on certain nights when the air turns still and the stars hang lower than they should, the wind dies completely. The dogs fall silent. The fires do not move. And if you walk out onto the ridge and listen hard enough, you can hear it, the faint metallic click of a camera shutter, followed by the slow, steady hum of something remembering. The night the sky stood still was never about one photograph. It was about the moment history looked back, the moment the past refused to stay buried. And even now, under the frozen stars of Dakota, when the air stops moving and the world goes quiet, you can still feel it. The stillness, the breath that never left, the photograph that never stopped looking back, and the wind waiting patient as time for its next command to move. It began quietly. The kind of quiet that feels like a question, the kind that comes before something breaks. By the time anyone noticed, the stories had already crept back out of the archives, one whisper at a time. It started with a letter. A researcher from the University of South Dakota, Dr. Samuel Avery, had been granted access to a set of Bureau of Indian Affairs documents marked Restricted 1880s, 1890s. He was searching for information about early Native delegations, nothing more. But among the dusty papers and brittle ledgers, he found a name that kept repeating: Oglala Council, Pine Ridge. Each reference led to the same catalog number, the same missing photograph. The deeper he looked, the stranger the record became. Notes crossed out, file cards removed, signatures erased. He requested the image itself. The archivist hesitated. "That one's special," she said softly. "How special people don't like to touch it." When it finally arrived, a plain envelope unmarked. Avery hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single contact print on faded paper. Not the original glass, but a copy. The image was faint, slightly fogged around the edges, but the faces were unmistakable. 8 men seated, 4 standing behind, their eyes steady, fixed forward. The air around them seemed thick, as though the light itself were heavy. Avery leaned closer, squinting, and then he froze. In the background, just above the left shoulder of the man in the center, there was something, an outline that didn't belong. A blur. A suggestion of motion, like smoke but shaped like a hand. He adjusted the lamp, thinking it was glare. The mark didn't change. He made a note: possible damage resembles movement. But when he turned the light away, the shadow was gone. That night he dreamed of wind. Endless wind moving through tall grass, carrying voices he couldn't understand. When he woke, his windows were open. Though he had locked them, the curtains were still. Avery wasn't a superstitious man. He believed in documents and evidence and the dry truth of ink and paper. But something about the photograph began to follow him. At first it was small things, the faint smell of smoke when he studied it, a static hum when he touched the frame. Then came the whispers, not words, tones. A rhythm low and steady like the sound of drums heard from far away. He brought the image to a technician for scanning. The man loaded it into the machine, ran the first pass, frowned and ran another. "That's odd," he said. "It's not stable." "What do you mean, the pixels shift?" "Every frame's a little different, like it's alive." Avery laughed, but the sound came out hollow. He asked for the file anyway. Later that night, alone in his office, he compared the scans. The figures hadn't changed, but the background had. Faint ripples moved across the surface of the wall behind the council as if something were stirring there beneath the silver grains. He sent a copy to the Smithsonian for verification. The response came 2 weeks later. Image appears unaltered. However, digital interference suggests unstable data structure. Recommend physical examination of original source. He never received the original. Weeks later, Avery traveled west to Pine Ridge itself. He wanted air distance context. What he found was something else entirely. The reservation stretched endlessly under a bruised sky-open land that felt both infinite and enclosed, haunted by silence. The hills rose dark against the horizon, wind sweeping through the dead grass with the sound of whispers. He rented a small room near the edge of the old agency grounds. That first night, the wind stopped. He woke to a sound soft, rhythmic, unmistakable. The click of a camera shutter. Once, then silence. He sat up, heart-pounding, staring into the dark. There was no one there, only the faint smell of oil and sage. When morning came, his windows were coated in frost, though the air outside was warm. He spent the next days tracing every mention of the photograph through the community. Most had never heard of it, but one old woman, Eleanor Two Elk, recognized his description instantly. "The picture that breathes," she said. Her eyes glimmered with memory. "My grandfather said it took the voices of the hills, said that when they sat for it, they heard a sound behind them, like the earth inhaling." She told him about the night the stars froze, the air went still, and the ancestors returned. "They weren't posing," she said. "They were praying." When he asked what they were praying for, she smiled faintly. For the land to remember. The next day, Avery visited the ruins of the old agency studio, the place where the photograph had been taken. The building was gone, but the foundation remained, a few warped boards scattered across the earth. The air was calm. Too calm. Even the grass seemed reluctant to move. He walked to the center of the foundation where the floor would have been. The ground there felt different, firmer, colder. He knelt, brushing away the dust, and uncovered something buried just below the surface, a shard of glass. Perfectly smooth on one side, etched on the other. It shimmered faintly, catching the light. When he held it up for a moment, he thought he saw faces in it, blurred, flickering, familiar. Then a gust of wind hit his back, hard, sudden, and the shard slipped from his hand, vanishing into the grass. That night, the wind didn't return. He began to write, obsessively filling page after page with note states, account streams. The deeper he went, the more his writing changed. The crisp academic language gave way to fragments, half-thoughts, pauses marked with ellipses. They are not gone. Only waiting. I can hear it when the wind stops, like breathing through the walls. The photograph remembers. Then abruptly his notes stopped. A week later, his colleague at the university received a parcel, no return address. Inside was a single item, a contact print of the Oglala Council photograph. On the back, written in Avery's hand, were 4 words: "The wind moved again." He was never seen after that. His car was found abandoned near the edge of the Badlands, keys still in the ignition door open, dust covering the seat. There were no footprints leading away. Months later, a team sent by the Bureau arrived to catalog the remaining material. Among Avery's things, they found a small reel of magnetic tape unmarked. When played, the recording began with the hum of an old tape recorder static, then a faint voice, Avery's, distant, nervous. "It's louder now. I can hear them. They're not in the photograph anymore. They're in the air. They're in the wind. Every time it stops, I can feel it. Something pushing through." A pause, then a sound, a soft metallic click, unmistakable. The sound of a camera shutter. After that silence, the tape ends there. The report was sealed. The tape filed under miscellaneous, not for release. The Bureau denied ever receiving it. But in the following years, new rumors began to surface, photographers visiting Pine Ridge and capturing strange distortions in their images. Light bending, faces appearing where none should be. One even claimed that when he developed his film, the photograph of the council appeared faintly over his own shots, like a ghost double exposure burned into history itself. Today, the story lives in the space between history and myth. The photograph has not been found again, or perhaps it has, and those who found it chose silence. But Pine Ridge still remembers. The old ones still tell of the night the stars froze, the wind stopped, and time itself waited for breath. They say that when the world goes too fast, when men forget the cost of their own shadows, the sky will stop again. That the ancestors will rise not in anger, but in remembrance to remind the living what the stillness sounds like. Because the night the photograph was taken, something happened that cannot be undone. Light froze, breath became memory. The line between the seen and the unseen vanished for a heartbeat, and that heartbeat still echoes. Sometimes when storms roll down from the north and the air grows heavy, the wind over Pine Ridge falls silent. The grass stiffens, the horizon trembles, the world holds its breath, and if you listen long enough, you can hear it. The faint sound of a shutter closing. The slow exhale of a world remembering itself. And somewhere in a place no map can mark, the photograph opens its eye again. Because history is not dead. It sleeps. And every now and then, the wind moves. When it does, you'll know. The air will go still, the stars will hesitate, and the silence will hum with life. That's when the Oglala will return to council and the sky will stand still once more. The world moved on, but Pine Ridge never did. The rest of America buried the century beneath progress and noise trains and telegraphs factories and light. But here on the edge of the Dakota Plains, the air still carries the silence of that one night when the wind forgot to move. It lingers like a pulse too faint to die, like a drumbeat heard through snow. The Oglala still speak of it not as history, but as something living. Something waiting. They call it the night the breath of the earth was stolen. Outsiders call it myth, yet no one who's walked this land at dusk would dare laugh. There's a weight here. You can't name something that presses against the ribs that makes you listen, even when nothing speaks. The grass moves, but you can't feel wind. The clouds hang still, painted against a sky that seems to watch you back. Decades passed. Governments changed. New treaties came and went. The agency buildings rotted into their own shadows. But the photograph, somehow always it resurfaced. In 1921, a graduate student cataloging visual records of the Sioux found it misfiled among mining documents. He described it as eerily intact faces, impossibly clear. He showed it to his professor, who insisted it be returned to storage. That night, the student wrote in his diary, "Their eyes followed me out of the room." He never finished his thesis. By the 1940s, the photograph had become a rumor among curators. They said it could never be copied properly. Each reproduction came out different, sometimes darker, sometimes blurred, sometimes missing one figure entirely. No one could explain it. When colorization techniques arrived decades later, a technician tried to restore it for a documentary. The color bleed refused to hold. It slid off the faces like paint off stone. The final print was useless, but in the upper corner under ultraviolet there was movement. Not dust, not damage. Movement. He quit that same day. Every generation at Pine Ridge has its own version of the story. The elders say that the silence from that night still drifts through the Black Hills, circling every winter like a slow, invisible storm. The land, they say, has memory, and memory has a way of resisting the living. One old man who claimed to be the grandson of Tall Bear spoke of the hum that came before snowfall. He said it wasn't wind, it was breathing. The earth, he whispered, is still holding that night inside her lungs. When the young ones laughed, he didn't. You'll hear it when you're alone, he said, when you stop trying to. Even now, when the northern lights ripple over the plains, the color seems wrong, too pale, too deliberate, as if the sky is replaying something we missed. Hunters have seen shapes walking under the green light, men with long hair, heads bowed, moving in silence through grass that doesn't move. Once a police officer driving past the old agency site saw a faint glow in the snow, a perfect circle of frost that shimmered even after dawn. He tried to photograph it. The camera jammed. They say cameras still fail here. Batteries drain faster. Audio recorders catch nothing but wind, even when there is no wind. In 1963, a small team of anthropologists arrived to document residual superstitions on the reservation. They were skeptics. They interviewed families, recorded testimonies, and dismissed every tale as folklore. Until the last night of their stay. A blizzard had blown in from the north, unexpected, furious. One of the researchers, a woman named Amelia Frost, wrote her final note by candlelight. "The wind has stopped. I can't hear the fire. I feel like I'm being watched." She froze to death 10 feet from her tent. The others found her upright eyes open, snow unmelted on her eyelashes. The case was marked exposure. The Oglala called it recognition. The world outside Pine Ridge had long forgotten the old photograph, but sometimes quietly, it found its way back into history. In the 1980s, a historian from Rapid City discovered a blurred image in an auction catalog titled Unknown Delegation, circa 1880s. The caption was wrong, the location wrong. But the faces, oh, the faces. He bought it immediately despite its price and kept it in his office. Within weeks, he fell ill. He told his wife that he could no longer sleep, that every time he closed his eyes, he heard whispering. She thought it was fever, but the day before he died, he left a note folded inside his journal. They want to be remembered the way they were, not the way we recorded them. After his death, his widow tried to donate the photograph to the museum. They refused to accept it. The archivist said it had already been cataloged in 1900, but that couldn't be, because the catalog number she quoted belonged to an image destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1933. Some say the fire wasn't an accident. They say it was an attempt to bury what couldn't be explained, to erase something that wouldn't stay still. Others say it didn't matter, that even if the photograph were burned, its shadow would remain. You can't destroy silence, you can't unmake a moment the Earth itself decided to remember. And the Earth remembers. In 1990, after the first snowfall of winter, a photographer named Michael Drayton traveled through South Dakota working on a project about ghost towns of the American West. He had never heard of the Oglala Council story. He set up his tripod near the edge of the old agency ruins where the ground rises slightly toward the hills. He took 6 exposures. The last one jammed the shutter. The mechanism broke clean in half. When he developed the film, 5 frames were perfect landscape light ruin. The 6th was something else entirely. The frame was black except for one faint image near the center, 8 men seated in a half circle, half buried in shadow. He stopped photographing that day. The negative vanished weeks later from his studio. No sign of theft, only dust on the shelf where it had been kept. Drayton moved east, gave up photography, and spent the rest of his life painting abstract landscapes, soft, colorless, wide as silence. In one interview before his death, he said, "I've seen what stillness looks like. You can't paint it, you can only remember it. Time moves, but not evenly. Some places refuse. Some moments stretch across centuries like scars. Pine Ridge is one of them. People still come from far away to walk the hills to see if the story is true. They stand where the studio once stood, waiting to feel something, an echo, a chill, a heartbeat in the wind. Some leave disappointed. Others leave changed. There's a woman named Marie Eagle Feather, a schoolteacher who says she saw the stillness herself. She was closing up the classroom one winter evening when the air suddenly thickened. The chalk dust in the air froze mid-flight. The lamp stopped flickering. The ticking clock fell silent. And then nothing. No sound, no motion, just the deep, living quiet that makes you aware of every beat of your own heart. She said it lasted maybe a second, maybe a lifetime. Afterward, she went outside. The snow had begun to fall again. The wind moved. But the stars above the Black Hills, they didn't. Scientists call it imagination, atmospheric refraction, optical illusion. But even they avoid explaining the details because physics can't quantify a silence that feels aware, because chemistry can't measure a stillness that breathes. Every few decades, another story surfaces. A tourist snaps a photo near the old agency and finds the image distorted, light-warped horizon, tilted the faint outline of men where none were standing. A local radio host swears that during a blizzard broadcast, his equipment picked up voices soft, rhythmic, repeating the same phrase in Lakota. Translators later claimed the words meant, "The sky remembers." And when satellite imaging passed over Pine Ridge in the early 2000s, technicians at NASA flagged an anomaly temperature readings dropping 6 degrees across a single square mile, a perfect circle centered exactly where the old council chamber once stood. They ran the data 3 times. Each time the pattern reappeared. They labeled it topographical variance, then they stopped looking. In the Lakota tongue, taku wakan means that which cannot be explained. It's the word for mystery, for the sacred, for the unseen. The elders say the photograph is taku wakan, made visible a doorway between what was and what will be. They say it will awaken again when the land is ready to heal. And so the story endures. When winter comes, when the clouds hang low and the air freezes in place, families still gather by the fire to tell it. The young ones roll their eyes, the old ones smile. But somewhere deep in that telling, there's a pause, a moment when the fire snaps and every breath in the room seems to slow. And in that silence, they all feel it, the faint hum beneath the world, the rhythm of something vast and patient and alive. They say it's the heartbeat of the photograph, the moment the sky stopped and never started again. Today, the hills stand quiet. The mines are gone, the soldiers gone, the treaties dust. But the land remains stubborn as memory. Some say they've seen the photograph in the dreams of the hills themselves in lightning and cloud and frost. The faces of those 8 men looking out from the land they could not save but refused to leave. Others say the real photograph isn't glass or paper at all. It's the plains themselves, the still air, the frozen horizon, the sky that watches and waits. Because the truth of Pine Ridge is not what was captured that night. It's what was left behind. A silence too deep to vanish, a story too old to die. And if you ever find yourself there standing in the middle of that open emptiness, the wind caught between breaths, close your eyes. Listen, you might hear it too, the soft click of a shutter from another century. The sigh of a land remembering itself, the heartbeat of the sky still holding its breath. They say the ancestors never left. They're in the wind. They're in the grass. They're in the spaces between the stars that refuse to move. And maybe that's why, even now when the world turns too fast and noise drowns everything, wholly the Black Hills still stand still. Because some memories are stronger than time. Because some moments, some silences are eternal. The Oglala Council never truly ended. It continues whenever the wind stops, whenever the stars hesitate, whenever someone dares to listen. And one day when the stillness comes again, when the sky decides to hold its breath for the second time, they say the land will open and the voices of that photograph will speak once more. They will not speak of death, they will speak of return. Of land, of sky, of all that was stolen and all that still waits to be remembered. Until then, the photograph sleeps. The glass hums faintly in the dark, and above it, the air remains heavy, full alive, as if the world itself is still trying to finish that breath. The wind returns slowly across Pine Ridge, not as sound, but as a feeling thin, weightless, almost human. The grass bends with it, but the motion is hesitant, like the plains themselves are remembering how to breathe. It's been more than 100 years since the photograph was taken, yet the air here still carries that silence, that stillness that doesn't belong to time. The world has changed everywhere else machines have swallowed the noise of nature. Cities hum like veins of metal, but here the sky holds the same patient face it wore that night. It has not forgotten. It never will. If you walk the hills alone, no car, no sound, only your footsteps, you'll feel it before you hear it. The rhythm, the invisible pulse that hides beneath the soil. It's faint, but it's there, a heartbeat not of man, but of earth itself. People call it wind. Scientists call it atmospheric pressure. The Oglala call it memory. They say the photograph is still buried somewhere beneath the old agency ground, wrapped in cloth, sealed from light. But even if the glass has cracked, even if the chemicals have faded, the image lives. Not in archives, not in paper, not in history books, but in the land itself. Every winter, the same circle of frost appears on the ridge, perfectly round, untouched by sun. Every time the wind dies, the same hush falls, the same impossible quiet that once filled that small studio. The Oglala elders say it is the council speaking again, through the breath of the land. No one really believes it until they hear it for themselves. There's a ranger named Thomas Hale who works the reservation perimeter. He's a man of reason, Army veteran, no patience for myths. But one night, while checking the fences near the old foundations, he saw the horizon change. The moonlight dimmed. The air flattened. Even the insects stopped. And then, a sound. Not a voice, not thunder, not a machine, just a slow metallic click, followed by a hum so deep it made his bones ache. He turned his flashlight off, stood still, and waited. The hum rose and fell like breathing. He said later it lasted less than a minute, but in that minute he thought of every name he'd ever forgotten, every promise broken, every face he'd seen fade from memory. Then the wind came back hard and cold. When he got home, his watch had stopped. He doesn't wear one anymore. Time moves strangely in Pine Ridge. The days stretch long, but the nights, they fold inward. Locals say clocks here run differently. No one knows if it's the air, the magnetism, or something else entirely. But it's real enough that even pilots flying overhead report malfunctions, altimeters freezing, mid-flight compasses spinning aimlessly until they leave the valley. They call it the still zone. The Oglala say it's the breath of the council, the place where the earth still holds that moment between shudder and silence. Sometimes when fog rolls in from the north, the hills vanish completely. The land turns to ocean. The only sound is the faint, rhythmic creak of old wood like a door opening somewhere in the distance. No one knows what it is, but those who've heard it all describe the same feeling, not fear. Recognition. They say you can feel the gaze of the men from that photograph, the weight of their stillness pressing through time. You can almost see them in the mist, tall shapes outlined against the horizon, unmoving, their silence louder than sound. Historians have spent decades trying to explain the anomalies surrounding the Oglala Council image. They talk of long exposure of damaged emulsion of unstable silver nitrate. They use words like coincidence, artifact, myth, persistence. But none of them stay long in the archives where the plate is kept. There are reports, unofficial of course, of curators hearing whispering from within the storage vault, faint, almost mechanical. One described it as breath in reverse. Another said that when the light hits the plate just right, the figures seem to shift ever so slightly, as if adjusting to a world that's changed without their permission. Some things you don't explain. You respect them. You let them breathe. And so the archivists learn to leave the photograph alone. They keep it sealed, wrapped in velvet, hidden beneath layers of climate control and bureaucracy. But the stillness that surrounds it leaks through air vents, through the floors, through memory itself. People who work above it complain of strange dreams. Always the same dream: a field of snow, a circle of men sitting in silence, and a sky so still it feels alive. The Oglala call this dream the remembering. They say the photograph is not a curse, it's a promise. A reminder that time does not move forward for everyone. That some moments once broken demand to be witnessed until the world learns to listen. In one of the last interviews recorded before his death, Joseph White Cloud, the last storyteller of the council line, was asked what the photograph meant to him. He sat quietly for a long time before answering. His voice trembled, but his eyes were steady. The white men thought they captured us, he said. But what they took was their own reflection. The stillness you see in that picture, that's not death. That's the earth holding its breath, waiting to see if you'll remember. He died 2 weeks later. The night he passed the wind in Pine Ridge stopped for 3 full minutes. Not a leaf moved. Every few years, the silence deepens again. Instruments record it, barometers dropping, wind sensors flatlining. The scientists write it off as equipment failure, but those who live here don't need readings. They feel it in their chest, in the weight of the air, in the way firelight bends and refuses to flicker. They stop talking. They listen. They remember. Some nights, the stars above the Black Hills flicker as if caught between frames of film. They freeze for seconds, then resume their slow crawl across the heavens. No astronomer has ever explained it. The Oglala say the stars too remember that night, the moment they looked down and saw man trying to trap spirit inside light. They were witnesses, an elder once said, and when you witness the sacred, you learn stillness. By the turn of the millennium, the photograph had become a quiet obsession among collectors of the strange. Copies circulate on the dark corners of the internet scans, reconstructions, digital ghost prints. But none are stable. The files degrade faster than any algorithm can explain. Pixels, blur data corrupts, metadata disappears. A photograph that refuses to be remembered by machine. It lives only through those who tell it. And maybe that's how it was meant to be. The Oglala believe that stories are living beings. You don't own them, you tend to them. Feed them with breath, keep them moving through generations. And when the telling stops, they fade. But the story of the night the sky stood still has never faded. Because the sky itself has kept the story. When lightning flashes across the plains, some say it reveals the shape of the council etched against the storm clouds for the briefest moment. A ring of silhouettes unmoving their faces turned towards something we can't see. The thunder that follows isn't thunder, it's applause from the earth. And what if it's true? What if the world really did stop that night? What if just for an instant time held its breath, waiting to see if man would understand what he was taking? Because maybe the photograph wasn't a record, maybe it was a warning. A mirror held up to the moment civilization forgot how to listen. The Oglala believed the sky was alive. They believed every gust of wind, every drift of cloud, every shadow on the plains carried a spirit. And when that sky went still, it wasn't emptiness. It was presence, the stillness of the sacred. We call it silence, they called it prayer. Now the years move like ghosts over the land, slow, translucent, full of echoes. The hills have softened the rivers, carved deeper paths. But the silence is still here. You can hear it in the spaces between trains and the hum of telephone wires that cross the reservation. You can feel it in the air before a storm breaks, that deep anticipatory quiet, the pause before the world speaks again. And sometimes it does speak, in whispers, in dreams, in the flicker of light through the clouds, voices you can't record, only remember. They say the last time the photograph was really handled, was by a curator who'd never heard the story. She unwrapped the cloth, placed it under the light, and said aloud, "Why are they looking at me like that?" Her colleagues said she froze for almost a full minute. When she finally moved again, she wrapped the photograph and left the building. She never came back. No one blamed her. Because there's something about that silence that doesn't let you go. Maybe that's why we still tell this story. Because somewhere inside us we recognize it. That ache for stillness. That instinct to listen. That quiet part of the human soul that remembers when the world was slower, when we could hear the hum beneath creation itself. And so the story lives breathing through every retelling, growing stronger with every pause. Each time someone speaks the words, "the night the sky stood still," something in the air tightens as if the world remembers the script, as if the silence rehearses itself ready to fall again.